As an emergency physician, I've seen firsthand what happens when people lose themselves in their work. That's why I built a coaching practice grounded in real data, not guesswork. When we work together, you'll start with a DISC assessment, which will generate a 40-page deep dive into your behavioral strengths, your motivators, and the workplace triggers that cost you the most. Then we bring in objective biometric data. We can use any number of wearable devices, including the Oura Ring, to understand how your sleep and recovery directly shape your capacity for joy and performance. This isn't a one-size-fits-all program. Every coaching engagement is customized to you because the work of following your heartline looks different for everyone. If you're a healthcare professional ready to reconnect with why you started, visit the link in the show notes or head over to AndreaAustinMD.com.
Welcome to Heartline, Change-Making in Healthcare. I'm your host, Dr. Andrea Austin, a board-certified emergency physician, physician development coach, and educator. After years on the front lines, I've learned that real change in healthcare starts within. Each episode invites you to explore the inner work that unlocks clarity and bold leadership, because healing systems through change-making begins with following our heartlines.
Pod listeners, you are in for such a treat today. It is so rare that I have somebody on the podcast that has such an interesting way that she came to medicine, and the work that she is doing is incredible. I am so happy to introduce you to retired Colonel Jessica Bunin. She is a critical care physician, and she started her career in medicine as a psychiatrist. Let that sink in for a minute. Critical care with history of being a psychiatrist. That is just fascinating, and we could do a whole podcast just about that. But there's more. She has held leadership positions in academic medicine throughout the physician life cycle of undergraduate medical education, graduate medical education, and faculty development, to include critical care program director, assistant dean of faculty development, associate dean of DEI, associate dean of community, and professor of medicine and health professions education. She retired from the Army after 23 years with deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. She is co-founder, and probably the coolest title I've ever heard, Chief Architect of All Levels Leadership, a company designed to revolutionize healthcare leadership training through coaching and consulting. She is an International Coaching Federation certified executive leadership coach, and she is currently authoring her first book, From the Inside Out: How Self-Aware Leaders Build Trust and Transform Healthcare, which is due to be released this fall. And I have had the privilege of reading some early chapters in this book. So I will share with this audience. You're going to want to put this book on your list, and we'll have details on how you can stay up to date on the book's release in the show notes. Jess, it's wonderful to have you here.
Andrea, I'm thrilled to be here. This is so much fun.
How did you become a healthcare change maker, and when did you really begin to feel that your change-making energy was coming into its full power?
Such an important question. I feel like throughout most of my time in healthcare, I was trying to learn to take care of myself. I was trying to learn to become the most competent clinical physician I could. And then I was trying to become the most competent clinical educator I could. All of that really was very personally focused. And then I took my first job as a chief of critical care at Tripler Army Medical Center. And all of a sudden, I was not only responsible for the ICU, but also became sort of the driving force for some of the hospital-wide change projects. And it changed everything about how I viewed leadership, about how I thought of a team and who should be on a team and how you build a team, and how you sustain projects over time. It made me internalize every single one of Kotter's stages of change, because I think every single one of them is important and projects fail without them. And it just changed how I saw the people around me, what I needed from them and what they needed from me. And that is a huge project. So when I got there, soon afterwards, I learned that our central line infection rate was 5 times over the national benchmark at the time. And then I learned that we had a genetically identical VRE bacteria that several of our patients had. And I had to solve these problems. And I didn't know how to solve these problems, but I had lots of very smart people around me. And the project started as the infection control nurse, the ICU charge nurse, and me. And really quickly, I learned that was not enough to make this all move forward. So I don't know how much you want to hear about the project. I can dive in and tell you everything, but there's some really specific things that I think changed how I lead and how I think about it. One is that you have to think really broadly about who needs to be on your team, because it will be the unexpected people who bring the solutions and who drive change. So that is number one. And then number two is we feel like when we're asking for help from someone, we are asking them for a big commitment and we're sort of frightened to ask. At least I was. And I learned that people loved being part of a successful project, and it changed how they saw their job and how they saw healthcare and how they saw the team and the environment. And so those are sort of two of my big learning points that I got out of this. And I could talk all day about both of them. So I'll let you direct it a little bit.
Yeah, I think it would help the listeners to maybe get a bit more granular. So maybe at this point you were earlier in your career, fair to say. What was your initial thought on how to solve the problem? And then what was the biggest learning point on how the problem actually got solved?
Yeah. So when I started, it was an infection control problem. In my mind, this meant that doctors were not washing their hands between seeing patients. And I got one of our infection control nurses to sort of be a secret shopper. She would sit around and take notes about who washed their hands and who didn't when they walked in the room. And we did everything we could to increase hand washing, and it made no difference. And in the meantime, I was trying to put this team together really broadly. And I was thinking about every single person that walks into an ICU room on a daily basis. And I wanted one representative from each of those teams. So I needed the nursing team. I needed the physician team. I needed the surgical teams. I needed the physical therapy teams, the respiratory therapy team, the dietitians, the x-ray techs, and super importantly, the environmental services team. And so here I was in my head. The only problem was that people were not washing their hands. But we had our very first meeting of all of those folks, and we did an Ishikawa diagram to think about all of the possible things that could have led to this problem. And as we were talking about it, one of the environmental services faculty stands up and says, there's a problem I'm seeing here, and I don't know that everything in the room is getting cleaned. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, our contract as environmental services says that we're not allowed to touch anything that has a plug. We're not supposed to clean anything. And in an intensive care unit room, everything has a plug. Your bed has a plug. Your pumps have plugs. Your leg squeezers have plugs. Like everything has a plug. And so there were things in the room that blatantly weren't getting cleaned because the nurses didn't know that the environmental services folks couldn't do it. And the environmental services were sort of assuming that someone else was doing it. And if I had not had that woman in the room, it would have never occurred to me that was a problem. And so then we pulled the team together and went a completely different direction. And we started, initially, I'll tell you blatantly, I messed up this part of the project hugely, which is in that meeting, we created a checklist of who needed to clean what. And we took that and we put it on all of the nursing, all the nursing carts. We put it on all the housekeeping carts, all of the things so that everyone knew what they were supposed to clean. And then people revolted. And they were like, you just keep giving us more and more things to do. And I couldn't believe that people didn't want to solve this problem. But then I took a step back and brought Simon Sinek to mind and thought about, what am I doing here? Why am I trying to control this problem? And so we backed up. And I took it to an ICU staff meeting and I explained, here's where we are with our infections. Here's where we are with this genetic bacteria. We sent away to a lab to prove it was genetically identical, and it was. And now we've learned that the housekeeping staff isn't allowed to clean anything with a plug in the room. And I really need your help solving this problem. And over the next couple of days, the nursing staff put a team together that sort of solved this problem. And they made almost an identical checklist and had a different idea about how to distribute the checklist. And now they were part of solving the problem. So I was doing this with them instead of to them, which changed everything about how they embraced the project and how they wanted to be a part of the project. So that was one of the key indicators to me that I was growing and learning about change making, was that I had put a team together that could do it. And that I was able to step back and be like, wow, I messed this up. Can we start over and find a way to move forward together? So that was one of our sort of big learning points. The other thing for me is, I mentioned earlier, being afraid to ask folks for help. So we finally figured out how to make our project successful. We had a whole bundle of interventions to decrease our infection rate. And I needed the IT team, information technology team, to come in and get involved and help us with order sets and with anything that we could do to institutionalize the changes that we were making. And so I was really nervous about it. I went down, I knocked on their door. There were 2 folks in the room at the time, and I told them the problem and I asked them to get engaged. And right away they were like, yeah, we're happy to do that. And so they helped move in and institutionalize the project and get it going. And when I left Tripler 3 years later, 3 years after we had gotten that project up and running, the IT team had a party for me on the way out. And they said, we've worked here for a decade and we never felt like we were making a difference for patient care. And this is the first time we felt like we were a part of the hospital team making a difference for patients. And it changed how we saw our job and how we wanted to come to work in the morning and how we felt that we were part of a team for the first time. And so that was another really big eye opener for me, is that, first of all, people are likely going to say yes if you go face to face and ask them for help and explain a problem to them. But also it may change how they see things and they may love being involved.
Yeah, there are so many mega pearls there. And, I wonder, when you look back to that phase of your career, you were probably soon coming out of fellowship. And I think physician training has a lot of positives to it. And one of the things I took away from my training is that as a physician, I'm ultimately responsible for what happens to my patients. It's kind of this, the phrase from the book, I can't think of the author right now, extreme ownership of everything that happens to a patient. And I would say it's to a fault, because then when you're involved in these complex problems like the one you described, it's impossible for the physician to solve it. It is absolutely impossible. And so I think one of the key learning steps that you have to go through is shedding that it's a different kind of ownership. You still own the problem and the outcome, but you understand that going at it alone in this hyper functioning and over functioning that we had during training, it's not going to work for this new environment. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's exactly that. We are so focused on everything that happens to our patients and every intervention we make on our patients. And we watch the details, especially in the ICU, and I'm sure in the emergency room. We watch every single intervention we do for the exact results that we know if we need to undo it or do it more or whatever the case may be. But this was the first time where it wasn't about me and about what I was doing. It was about putting the right people together in a room to solve the problem. And I needed all the brains of all the people. My idea alone wasn't going to get there. Me and the infection control nurse and the charge nurse weren't going to get there. We would never have made a difference if I didn't see it differently. About now, my job wasn't about doing everything possible for the patient at the bedside. Now it was, wow, we have this huge hospital system. How do we pull everyone together that we need in this system to make something work and to make everyone feel a part of it? Which, again, like you said, it was my responsibility to do that, but it was a very different responsibility than making interventions at the bedside or patient outcome data. It was about team building effectively.
Yeah. And, one thing I hear from physicians all the time, and it's probably came out of my own mouth a few times, is, we're the ones at the bedside. We're actually doing the work. And then there's all these people in the hospital that never touch a patient. And you're right. There really are quite a few people that work in the hospital that become removed from the clinical outcomes. And so you can either rant on that and try to wear this white hat, I'm the one doing all the work, and then there's these people in offices. Or you could say, wow, there's all these various people in the hospital that their sole purpose is to take care of these patients. And in fact, my favorite story that I've heard about this was Brene Brown talked about when she walked into St. Jude and she was on the elevator with somebody and they looked like they were probably part of, I think they were carrying trays. So they were part of like the food service department. And she said, what do you do here at St. Jude's? And they said, without missing a beat, I'm curing cancer. And like, that is amazing. So imagine you ask anybody in the hospital that you work for, what do you do here? And they give some version of, I save lives, I change lives. And so one of the things I started to do is as I build this residency program, we have a bunch of people involved that never get to see what they're actually building. We have something called the resource group, and they procure supplies. And we've needed a lot of different equipment for our simulation center. And so as we wrapped up one of the meetings recently, I said, I'd really like it if your team could come to our sim lab and actually see the residents doing a simulation, because I think it would really help you understand what we're doing. And I'd like to thank you in person. And they really lit up when they heard that, because suddenly these product numbers and spreadsheets that they've been working so diligently on come to jump off the page. So for the people listening out there, I would just encourage you, you don't have to go at it alone. That was a myth that we were taught in residency, and you can shed it.
Absolutely. And I would just add to that, there are so many brilliant people who work in hospitals who chose to take their skills and put them to work in hospitals for a reason, because they want to make a difference, because they want to cure cancer or be involved in patient care. And we have to remember that and give them the opportunity to do what they came there to do. And we do have the influence and the power to do that.
So this was not on the questions that I sent you in advance, but it came to me as you were talking. And I think one of the real issues that prevents change from happening in healthcare right now is many people feel a deep sense of institutional betrayal. And I don't know if we've really talked about that in depth on the podcast before, but essentially institutional betrayal is this feeling that the entity that you work for has betrayed you. And it's related to the concept of moral injury. So if you're working in healthcare and you feel like you can't take care of your patients or take care of your colleagues in the way that you think is best, that could be a form of institutional betrayal. And so regardless of the healthcare system that I've worked in, I think if I had understood that concept before, it would have been helpful, because you go into a system and sometimes you're that new person like you were at Tripler, and you haven't been there for the 5 years, 10 years before. You haven't seen what's happened. And so when you walk into somebody's office and you're asking to do something different, sometimes the response is, it's not going to work because this place, it's broken. Nothing's ever been fixed here before, and it's just on a downward spiral. So what's your response to when you've worked in places that there has been this institutional betrayal and coming in as the change maker, trying to patch that up? And I can think of, you've written about the impact of a government shutdown. And I would say that's a form of institutional betrayal when the system doesn't pay you. So how do you navigate situations like that?
There's a lot of things that go into solving that problem. And I don't want at all to have my answer feel like I am minimizing what people go through, because it's real. The institutional betrayal is real. And we have to decide how we're going to solve that on smaller levels. And that means looking not only at the culture of our institution, but our microcultures. Like, what is the climate within our team that we are working with on that day? What is the climate of any team that I have some degree of influence on any given day? And how can I impact that? Because that's what changes how you feel about your work environment. What changes it is the people that are closest to you. Like, we always say this in the military, right? Like, it's about the guy in the foxhole with you. It's not about the president or whoever that makes you do heroic things to save lives. It's the people next to you. And so remembering that and remembering the power that you have with those people, the power that you have to make their day better, the power that you have to thank them, the power that you have to bring them into solving the problems and listen truly to what they have to say before you give your ideas. I think having small teams feel good about each other and feel like they can make a difference together, that is where we start solving that. And at least it makes the days productive and enjoyable. And at least your moral injury isn't diving into that particular team or scenario. But then it grows from there, which is pretty regularly, I think we feel this sense of learned helplessness because we can't fix every aspect. But I think we as individuals and as leaders specifically, and as change makers, have more influence than we think we do. And we can't give up on that. We have to keep trying and keep pushing. And there's also a time where your institution and your values and your cultures are not going to be consistent. And there's going to be a time when you do need to walk away, whether it's for your emotional health, for your physical health. You see illegal things happening and you just can't make yourself do them. Whatever the case may be, I want to encourage people to walk away when they need to walk away if the institution that they're working in truly isn't going to ever be consistent with their values.
Before we get into today's episode, I want to share something that I think a lot of you need to hear about. Heart of Medicine 2026 is an international gathering of compassionate leaders in medicine. Doctors, nurses, allied health clinicians, coaches, healthcare leaders, all coming together July 29 through 31 at Voyagers Ayers Rock Resort in Central Australia. And yes, it's in Uluru, the spiritual heart of Australia. Because this event is intentional about where it places you, not just what it teaches you. You'll learn from world-class faculty about heart-centered care, compassionate leadership, and what it actually looks like to build a longer, more fulfilling career in medicine. You'll leave with the skills, community, and honestly, your spirit a little bit more intact. This is not a typical CME box check. This is the kind of gathering that reminds you medicine is still worth fighting for. I'll be there, and I'd love to see you there. Registration is limited because the resort is remote and intimate. So don't sit on this one. Link is in the show notes. Yeah, I think there's so much there. The other thing that came to mind listening to you speak, and when I've had these difficult conversations with somebody like, you haven't been here, you didn't see what happened 5 years ago when we tried something similar, is when we talk about the institution or the system, we often talk about it like it's a person. And the fact is it's not, right? So the system is this aggregation of all of us, right? And so sometimes, being the leader is sitting and obviously listening to what they're saying and also owning it. That, you know what, you're right. That wasn't okay. And it's providing that moment of reconciliation for a system that hurt people. And there is no entity, there is nobody that's going to own all the system problems. And so sometimes that really does, I think, come back on us as the leader to be the human face of that and say, I hear that. And here's where I think there is a glimmer of hope, or here's what I'm seeing that I think is a little bit different than the situation that happened 5 years ago. And the last thing I'll say is I also think when you're experiencing institutional betrayal or inertia, I also think that people are waiting to see if you're going to be courageous. And I think courage is something that we don't talk about enough in healthcare. So do you have any stories or suggestions? And I think courage is this word where it's like, okay, well, we were in the military. We know what courage looks like on a battlefield. But what does courage look like in healthcare?
Yeah, I have so many feelings about this. So first, I'm going to connect it back to the story that I was sharing before. And we had a whole bundle of ICU infection control interventions that we were doing all together. And our nurses still didn't feel empowered to ask people to do the right thing. So we wanted people to take their white coats off. We wanted people to take their fleece jackets off before they crossed a threshold of a room and wash their hands. And we instituted a bare below the elbows protocol so that people could wash their hands well, go in the rooms and not bring bacteria with them. And the nurses felt like, well, I can't stop every doctor who's going to go in a room. They're going to fire me. They're going to yell at me. It's going to be horrible. It's going to make my day miserable. And one day we had a 4-star general come in to visit a patient. And I asked the 4-star general to take his blouse off and wash and put on a yellow gown before he went in the room. And the nurses watched me do this. And by the next day, they were all talking to each other about, we can ask a doctor. She just told a 4-star general to do it. And so there's little steps like that where you can empower people and show them courage in small ways to make a difference. And I do think that really matters. I think every time you stand up to someone on someone else's behalf, it does show moral courage. So my view of moral courage originally came from Ira Shaliff. Does a lot of work with followership. And he talks about the courages of followership. And one of the courages is the courage to take moral action. And so a friend and I wrote an article about the courages of followership, the courage to stand up to someone, the courage to challenge someone, the courage to speak to hierarchy, all of these things that I think truly do take a lot of moral courage now more than ever to do this. We wrote this paper and we sent it in to a journal. And one of the reviewers sent it back to me and said, think again, you're in the military. Courage is something on a battlefield. Courage is not something of a follower. And I was appalled. I thought that was the worst way to approach this problem and to empower people, is to say they weren't being courageous when they truly were acting on moral courage. So the other way that I started thinking about moral courage after that came from Rushworth Kidder. And he talks about, in order for something to require moral courage and for you to practice moral courage, you have to be really solid in your values and what you believe and what you're going to tolerate. So that's sort of your value system. And then there's this idea that if you follow your value system to a T, there's a risk. And you have to be aware of what that risk is and be willing to face that risk. And then the third part is you have to have something that helps you endure. So for example, let's go back to the situation with the 4-star general. My value was patient care and survival at that point. That was the only thing I was thinking about. That was my value, and I wasn't going to budge on that. The thing that was at risk is maybe I was going to get yelled at by a 4-star general, and then maybe that 4-star general was going to file a complaint with the hospital against me, and maybe I was going to lose my job, right? Those were all possible risks that went along with that. And what was going to help me endure was that I knew that I had the nurses on my side to help me get through the day if any of that happened, to stand up for me in that situation. So I had sort of the 3 parts of that, and it helped me make the right decision. And thinking through that problem is a pretty big deal about how we want to frame that. And that can be on a small scale for a medical student who is challenging a resident for the first time, or challenging a pretending who's made a mistake for the first time. And that can be on a large scale with standing up to a political stance that you feel is intolerable or whatever the case may be. So I think you need to start like building the muscle early, practicing so that it becomes second nature for you to see something and know, I'm not going to be able to look at myself in the mirror tomorrow if I don't do something about this today. And I think that's moral courage.
Yeah, I love that. And I just hope the listeners out there find small and big ways to practice it, because I really do think moral courage and leaning into our moral compass can fix a lot of the issues that we're experiencing in healthcare. And the tagline for this podcast is to follow your heart line. And the heart line is this metaphor of your emotions. And I think, again, kind of that shedding of, what we learn in medical school and residency is my medical school experience. I felt the main emotion that they were trying to get us to have was a lack of emotion. There was really a big emphasis on stoicism. And I also think it may have been culturally. I trained in the Midwest and people are kind of stoic in the Midwest. And what I really think now what's needed for us to thrive medicine is what Susan David talks about, is this concept of emotional agility. So when you feel this sense of heartbreak, of hurt, of sadness, instead of pushing it down, saying, where is that coming from? And for most of us in healthcare, it's coming from, I want to take great care of my patients and there's something getting in the way. And so using that as something that we can actually use as the fuel, I think is really the key. So as you're doing this change-making work, the other thing that happens is conflict. And we're seeing conflict in all sorts of ways. We see it certainly within the healthcare hallways, sometimes on display between consultants. We see it certainly with policy issues. And then we're also seeing you've already said the P word, politics, really enter healthcare in a very striking way. So another area that you write and speak about is on this concept of civil discourse. Can you explain what that is and maybe some practical tips for practicing it?
Yeah, absolutely. Civil discourse, I believe, is our way forward. We can't be avoiding conversations with people we disagree with. And I hear this from students pretty regularly, like, I don't want to talk to that guy. They're not going to get me. And I believe when we start having deeper, better conversations, we realize we have a lot more in common than we think we do. And it may come down to only the values. We may have nothing else in common other than the values, but at least that gives us a starting point. But what civil discourse is communicating effectively across difference so that you can move forward together. And it is not debate. Debate is, I'm going to win this argument and I'm going to convince that person that they're wrong. And then we're going to move forward with my decision, which means I'm going to bring my pile of 15 articles and you're going to bring your pile of 15 articles and we're going to have a pro-con debate. And one of us is going to win and one of us is going to lose. And then we're going to move forward with that decision. That's not civil discourse. That's debate. So in civil discourse, you're not trying to change anyone's mind in any way. You're just trying to get a bigger lens on the world so that you can see things differently the next time you encounter them. So that's one side of it. The other thing I hear pretty regularly is civil discourse being equated with political correctness or decorum. And that is not true either. In civil discourse, you must be able to state your mind and state your values and state them honestly and openly. But the key is that we're not judging each other for that. And again, we're not trying to change each other's minds. We're just listening. And I think there's 5 pillars that have to exist for this to be successful. The first one is that we have to create psychological safety. The next is that we need to listen actively. The next is that we have to encourage finding that common ground, establish that common ground, whether that is a story that we shared in the past or an experience that we both know about and felt, or whether it's our value of patient care or loyalty or truth or whatever our value is that we share. So establishing some common ground. And then we have to adjust our thinking a little bit and say, what if? What if I'm wrong? What if they're a little bit right? Like, how can I adjust my thinking today and change my mind about how I came into this conversation? Not with a goal of changing the other person's mind, but just how might I be able to see things differently, adjust my own thinking? And then the final part of that is to respond skillfully when someone says something that harms you or hurts you, or someone says something that catches you off guard. How do you say that that bothered you without shutting the other person down and without shaming the other person? And I believe that there's important skills that go into that, like having phrases for when someone hurts you and having phrases for when someone says that you've hurt them. So as an example, if I ever hear something in one of these conversations and it just rubs me wrong and I'm in it, so I don't have a lot of brain power, I'm like really trying to listen and focus on what the person's saying. So I don't have the words to come back with what I mean just yet. So instead I say, wait, what? And that gives me a second to pause, hear more clearly what they said, ask them more clearly what they said, and then we can move forward with a better conversation about it because I've had a second to pause, I've had a second to reflect and breathe before I move forward. And then if someone points out that I've done something to hurt them, my phrase that rolls off my tongue before I think of another word is, wow, thanks for pointing that out. And I just say it every time, no matter what the scenario is. If I'm in a group of 200 people and someone gives me harsh feedback, or if I'm in a one-to-one conversation and I said something that hurt someone, wow, thank you for pointing that out. And it just gives me a second to process what they said, to think about it, and to move forward effectively with the conversation without continuing to hurt them or harm them, but also to be able to say, I didn't realize I had that bias. I did. I'm sorry. Can we talk about how to move forward more effectively from that point? Or something along those lines. So I call that whole thing the CLEAR framework. So creating psychological safety, listening actively, establishing common ground, adjusting our thinking, and responding skillfully. And if we can work on each of those pillars individually, any one of them is going to improve the interactions you have with someone you disagree with. But if we can work on all of them, that's the gold. Like, that's where we're really going to see change in our relationships and growth in our thought processes.
That is such a masterclass, and that's, such a great framework that you've developed. And when I'm listening to that, what I'm thinking is that really requires somebody to be mindful. You have to be present. And then what I also really like about the phrases that you've shared, even if the critique that they are providing you think is baseless, when you say, wow, thanks for pointing that out, you're not agreeing with what they just said. In the purest sense, you're saying, okay, well, you spoke up about something, and whether I thought this was an issue or not, now, we're going to have to work through this. So it's not saying that they're right, but it is acknowledging them for at least taking the moment to bring it up. Because honestly, in the most dysfunctional teams that I've been a part of, is conflict doesn't happen. It's apathy, it's silence, it's niceness. And then that often leads to passive aggressiveness, which is honestly my least favorite thing to deal with. I would rather have conflict and have a lot of discomfort up front than the passive aggressiveness that we often see.
Yeah. Well, that whole phenomenon that you're talking about of hearing someone else's viewpoint, even if you don't agree with it, I call it legitimization. So we are acknowledging that someone else's perspective is real and is legitimate and is valuable and is worth hearing. And by the way, I don't agree. I can say that you're legitimate, your values are legitimate, and your perspectives are legitimate, and they don't have to be mine, but I do have to hear them and give them an opportunity to sink in and make a difference before I move forward. And that concept applies a lot in clinical medicine. So if we can think about seeing a patient who disagrees with us on vaccine hesitancy, for example, and instead of saying, here's the article, you're wrong, we can say, tell me why you think that. And then say, wow, that's a really legitimate perspective. Can I share my perspective? Totally different conversation than saying, here's what the studies say and you're wrong. It's instead saying, I understand exactly where you're coming from now. I didn't understand before. Let's start there. So whatever, all of the politics that are in our face, if we can have civil discourse about them, instead of just actively disagreeing and throwing articles at each other, I think it's going to be a lot more effective if we can legitimize each other's perspective, not agree, but legitimize what they think and why they think that and how they got there.
Yeah. And, I deal a lot with emergency physicians. And one of the biggest lessons I've had to learn in my career is, unless it's truly emergent, right? If you're trying to talk to a family about whether we're placing a breathing tube or starting pressors, there are times where things are truly emergent. But a lot of these conversations that we're having are not emergent, whether they choose to get the vaccine today or not. And so on days where I know that I'm really stressed, I'm very rushed, I have somebody else that I need to go see, let my conversation not cause harm. Let my conversation not further erode trust between patients and physicians. Let my conversation not be why they think going on Instagram and following a health influencer who sees them and DMs them back is a more valuable form of information and connection than coming to see me. So, it's this constant, really, again, we're coming back, and this is going to tie beautifully to your book, it's this deep knowing of self. And at all times, Brene Brown talks about, what do I need right now? What is my capacity right now? There's days where some of the freestandings I work in, I have one patient in the emergency department. So if we want to talk about, vaccines and prevention, preventative care, I'm able to stay in the room for 20 minutes. What a luxury. But then there's days where you have so many patients and your battery's just low. Like today, the audience may hear my throat's a little gravelly. I've been muting and drinking water. I've got a little cold. It's probably not the best day to have long conversations. So let's now tie this into your book. Can you share a little bit about what your book is about? And, there's quite a few leadership books out there. What makes yours a little bit different? And why are you so excited to share it?
Yeah, well, I'm super excited to share it. I can't wait. Part of the reason I'm writing it is I genuinely believe these are concepts we need to get out into the world right. And so that's part of my urgency that I feel behind this, and the passion I feel behind this, and why it's all flowed so naturally and easily out of me, is I believe in the words. So as you mentioned, the book is called From the Inside Out: How Self-Aware Leaders Build Trust and Transform Healthcare. And the book is divided into 3 parts, which is self-aware. How does a self-aware leader? The middle part is build trust. How do we think about trust on our teams? How do we optimize power and function on the teams we're currently working on? And then the third part is that transform healthcare. How do we move forward from here with more effective civil discourse, with more effective networking, with more effective conversations, with more psychological safety? How do we do that to create the systems where we want to go to work every day? And so those are the 3 key parts. And you mentioned that first part, the first 5 chapters are all about, how do I become a self-aware leader? How do I learn about the art and skill of reflection? And how do I do that? And maybe how do I get someone's help to get better? The next part is about, how do I learn about pauses? And you mentioned this earlier. Sometimes it's just about taking a moment and reflecting and thinking about what I need and how I need to move forward. or what my resident needs, or what my capacity is right now. And how do we use tactical and strategic and existential pauses to work ourselves, to work on our own understanding of who we are and how we might lead? How do we practice self-compassion? How do we become aware of our biases that we all have that are not a judgment on who we are? They just exist. How do we become a little bit more aware of them so that we can lead teams better and lead everyone on our team the way they need to be led? Not everyone needs to be led the same way. How can we become aware of that? And then the final part we've talked a lot about today, which is being aware of your values and having your values set in stone so that when you come across something that contradicts that value, you're not going to back off of it. And you're not going to let some drift happen and start making the wrong choices because you're solid in who you are, what your values are, and how you want to present yourself to the world and how you want to lead in this really challenging world of health. So that's the idea behind the book. So taking all of those self-awareness skills, bringing them to our teams and our trust building and our power sharing, and then bringing them out into the rest of the world to make the rest of the world and the rest of healthcare a better place to work in. So I'm super excited about that framework. The other thing that makes my book a little bit different than other leadership books is the first half of each chapter is really more of a memoir. So it's my stories from either having been a cancer patient. I had cancer 3 times early in my life. So how that changed how I viewed the world. So some of the stories are patient-based from my perspective. Some of them are critical care-based, the things that happen in an intensive care unit, the team building you need to do as a critical care chief, all of that comes into it. And then the third element is, what have I learned in military leadership and how does that carry forward? So in combat, what decisions need to be made as a healthcare leader in combat? How do you keep your team together through really hard times? And what are those challenging scenarios? So each of those are stories where I made a lot of mistakes, honestly. And I learned a lot and I grew all the time because I was able to do the first part of the book, which is that self-reflection. So it's sort of half memoir, half leadership guidebook.
I cannot wait until I'm holding a copy of your book. And I just want to share that, if you're listening to this and feeling inspired and would like to meet Jess, we're both going to be in Chicago at the Women in Medicine Summit at the beautiful Drake Hotel, September 26th through the 28th. And we'd love to see you. We'd love to dance with you on the dance floor at the gala. And anywhere else you're going to be this year or conferences that you'd recommend?
Yeah, so I'm going to the American Association of Physician Leaders, which is in Scottsdale. And I think it's the 22nd to the 24th of October, but don't quote me on that specifically. And then I haven't figured out all of my conferences for next year, but perhaps family medicine conferences, perhaps internal medicine or critical care conferences. But I have completely shifted my view of networking in the past year, where I used to think of it as sort of a dirty, unpleasant word. And now I think of it as making friends and thinking how I can help them grow and they can help me grow. And it has changed how I see networking. So I'm in. So if anyone sees me at any of those places, I would love to meet you. I would love to learn about you. I would love to hear how I can help you build the career you want and how we can do that effectively together. So I'm in. I'm in for all the networking.
I love it. And how can our listeners connect with you, see what you're working on, website, social media?
Yeah. So I'm on LinkedIn, Jessica Bunin. So fun fact, I'm the only Jessica Bunin in the world. So if you find a Jessica Bunin, it's me, and I'd be happy to hear from you. But you can find me at jess@jessbuninmd.com. Or you can find me. I have a small healthcare leadership company you mentioned up front. I'm a co-founder and chief architect, All Levels Leadership. So www.alllevelsleadership.com. We do coaching, we do consulting, we do curriculum development, whatever folks need on the leadership front. We'd love to hear from you. So I mentioned email, I mentioned LinkedIn. I am also on Instagram at Jess Bunin ALL for the All Levels Leadership. And I'm on Facebook at Jessica Bunin. So again, any Jess Bunin or Jessica Bunin in the world, and you will find me.
And you will be so glad you did. It has been such an honor to get to know you more over the last couple of years. I'd heard a lot about Jess. She spent a good portion of her career at the Uniformed Services University, and she was chair of my thesis committee. My thesis is focused on change making in healthcare, and I learned a lot from her during that process. And I'm just really thankful that our paths continue to cross, and your work is so needed. I really think about you, you're a program director, and I'm sure maybe some of my residents will hear this podcast. And, I think the thing that keeps me up at night is, can we fulfill the promise that they can live their careers as physicians, healthcare leaders, to take the best care of patients and to create work environments that, one, don't harm them. That's, you want to take away the negatives, but two, could really be places that they flourish. And, honestly, some days I think that's a really, really tall order. So the work is still very, very much needed. And I'm just thankful that there's leaders like you out there that's helping us all unlock the skills and mindsets that we need to be the change makers. Because as a past guest says, Dr. Christina Shenby, no one is coming to fix healthcare for us. No one. Not the politicians, not the payers, not pharma. And it's going to have to come from us. And that can trigger some grief. But the positive of that is we really don't want anyone else fixing this, because we actually know the solutions.
There's two key things there that give me a lot of hope that I want residents to hear also. One is, our residents are phenomenal. There is no way that I would get into medical school in this day and age with the amount of brilliance, innovation, and commitment and empathy that our trainees have right now. So know that you have those skills and that power, and those are powerful forces to change healthcare. So that's number one, I think, is a key part of that. The other thing that I think is really key here is we have to generate physician leaders. And I think leadership is a bigger thing in healthcare and medicine than it's been seen as historically. And I think we need to build that into everyone's education mentality, the actual curriculum, the actual learning. And I think if we do that, if we create, instead of physician leaders, maybe leaders who are doctors or leaders who are healthcare leaders, like that leadership part needs to be front and center. And those two things give me hope.
Well, I look forward to having you back on the podcast when your book has launched officially and we can hold up copies. And I just want to thank you for all that you're doing. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Thanks, Andrea. It's wonderful.
Thanks for listening to Heartline, Changemaking in Healthcare. If you're ready to deepen your own inner work or want to bring these conversations into your organization, visit AndreaAustinMD.com. You'll find resources and ways to connect with me for coaching, speaking, or consulting. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a 5-star review, and share this episode with a friend or colleague. Until next time, keep following your Heartline. This podcast represents the views of the host and guests. It does not represent the views of any entity we work for or with. It is also for informational use only and does not replace any professional advice, including medical or psychological. If you are interested in unlocking your true potential, reach out to me. If you're an organization interested in supporting the well-being of your people, I'd love to connect on innovative solutions. Schedule a strategy session at AndreaAustinMD.com.